So, welcome back to the channel. I noticed many of you have probably noticed that I haven't put up an edited video in a little while. The big reason for that, if you haven't been watching my Twitter or the announcements on Discord, is it's canning season. And as many of you know who do hang out in the Discord and have hung out in spaces where I show off the food that I cook and the stuff that I bring in from my garden, I have a massive food garden in my backyard. I have 20 square foot gardening beds. There used to be 22, but we had to replace a whole bunch of them this year, and we only had enough to, wood to replace 20 of them. Oh, thank you so much, Ikeda. Ikeda Hakubi, happy birthday times 13 for $65. Holy crap, thank you so much. Ikeda's referencing there, we had one of our pet rats, Kiwi, ended up mingling with Thor, and a few days ago had babies, and there's 13 of them. So I took pictures. Patrons have gotten to see them. They're going to be at the end of the next edited video I put out, so you guys will get to see them growing up just like the last rat babies. But yeah, Thor's a daddy, and we've got a batch of rat pups. But today I'm going to try to stay as focused as possible. I am going to prioritize super chat questions as they come in. Please try to keep them on the topic that I'm currently discussing. If you have additional questions that are a little more specific, I will take questions at the end, but I'm going to try to focus really hard on staying as on topic as possible for this. We're going to start with garden planning and space considerations, because I know that a lot of folks don't have their own houses, and I know that a lot of folks live in places like cities. For example, I only have a quarter acre. I know that some of you guys, you've seen that I grow 600-700 pounds of food in a year. That's absolutely bonkers, right? Because I only have a quarter acre. But very intensive growing methods and a lot of research can allow even a small space like that to produce a heck of a lot of food if you know what you're doing and you know what you'll use. So let's talk a little bit about figuring out what you can grow. Now, if you are in a small apartment and you've got a balcony, you've got a lot more options than if you don't. If you are in a small apartment and you don't have a balcony, most of your options are going to be either getting a set of tiered shelves and trying to get inexpensive low power LED grow lights so that way you can grow some smaller herbs and things, or putting herbs in your windowsill and trying to track them, turn the pots regularly, that sort of thing, so they don't get leggy. Fresh herbs still can connect you a great deal with the seasons and with your own cooking, because when you harvest them, they will add so much more flavor to the food you cook. It will get you a lot more excited about being in the kitchen, and it's also really cool if you've got kids to kind of teach them a little bit about, hey, this is where your food comes from. It's really neat to plant seeds, and actually, here's a fun fact, and I'm pretty sure this is true for all of the states. If you are on food stamps, you can buy seeds of food-bearing plants. I don't know if you can buy actual plant starts, but you can buy seeds of food-bearing plants with your food stamps at grocery stores and at big box stores. This is a thing that the federal government actually allows you to do. So that's really cool, and it's something that not a lot of people know. So if you are on the poverty end of things, there are ways to garden on the cheap, and one of them is that you can use a small portion of your food stamps for buying seeds for food-bearing plants. I don't know if you can buy flowers and stuff, but I know for a fact that, like, for tomatoes, that sort of thing, and I know this because I used to do it, and because it was in the pamphlets for the federal SNAP program. So let's talk balconies. There are a ton of cool things you can do on a balcony. Now, the first thing I'm going to tell you to do is stay the heck away from gimmicks. The upside down tomato plant things, those things are going to rot the base of your tomato plants and encourage all sorts of mold growth. Don't get that. Don't get the tiered strawberry upside down thing. If you want to do hanging baskets, there are excellent books on how to organize hanging baskets so you don't overcrowd them. Go for that for your vining crops. If you want to, say, grow squash, hanging baskets are a great way to do that. They're also a great way to grow green beans and peas and things like that. So if you have the ability to hang hooks on your balcony and put up hanging baskets, this applies to people who have backyards too. If you've got like a deck or something, you can put hanging baskets up and increase the vertical garden space. You can also get outdoor shelving and increase your vertical garden space. That way, if it's sort of like barred shelving, like I've got a photo somewhere of these really, really nice tiered sort of garden shelves that we have that are metal, and they allow light to flow through the back because the back is not, it's open. So you can grow a ton of stuff just on the cheap that way. Potatoes, for example, if your potatoes get eyes, you can save those. You can grow them in a large sack. You can grow a ton of them. Pots, you can also get very inexpensive pots, like cheaper plastic ones. And you can save your start pots to start things indoors, like if you purchase starts and things at some point throughout the year. We'll talk about choosing your seeds in a little bit, but if you want to grow things on a deck, you have a lot more options than you do if you just have a windowsill or a small apartment. So let's talk a little bit. Let's say you've got a little bit of a yard. Let's say you've got close to a 1/4 acre. Now, if you've got more than this, my advice can still apply, but you're going to have a lot more options in terms of the kinds of things you grow. But if you've got a 1/4 acre, say like I do, and you're willing to sacrifice a large portion of your backyard or your front yard, you can do what are known as square foot gardening boxes. These are 4x4, like usually 6-inch tall or 1 foot tall raised beds. Now, I recommend doing the raised beds, one, because they warm up a little faster. When it comes to the last spring frost date, you can plant things a little earlier. But two, if you have potential soil problems in your area, like, for example, my area, it was a mine nearby. In most of the people's backyards, you actually get a warning when you first buy your house here not to grow vegetables and things because there's toxic elements in the soil. Fortunately, the people who used to own our house before us actually had a daycare. So we got the first 5 or 6 inches of our soil replaced for free by the city so that they could make sure that the kids that they were hosting there didn't get sick. So I still have raised beds because I'm still concerned about it. But if you have a problem like that in your area, putting down a raised bed, putting a few inches of, say, gravel or rocks at the bottom, making your raised bed a little bit taller, and ordering, you can get dump trucks full of high quality dirt that is specifically soil mixes specifically for raised beds delivered to your backyard, especially if you've got any sort of access to it like we do, for a lot less expensive than trying to buy bagged soil. And it can be a space-saving measure because the square foot gardening method is actually a really, really concentrated way to get a heck of a lot out of your garden. If you're going to be doing that, though, you got to think a lot about your seeds. So once you've considered your space, that gives you an idea of what you are going to be able to grow. The second thing you need to do is check what growing zone you're in. Those numbers are going to determine both what's going to grow well in your area, and that number is going to determine what sort of seasonality you're going to have and what kind of harvest you can expect from different seasons. For example, I can get a spring cabbage harvest, but not so much a fall cabbage harvest because we are so, our rainfall is so heavy over here that often when we try to overwinter cabbages, they rot in the ground from all the rain. So considering that, we do spring cabbages here in Washington, and I do my sauerkraut and such with spring cabbages, and I don't try to overwinter them. I do, however, overwinter my my tubers and the like. Those I actually let get a lot bigger, and I more or less store those in my garden. So when you're considering how to do your planning, you first need to know what kind of space you're working with and what sort of labor and budget you're going to be willing to put into that. And then you need to figure out what your growing zone is, because step 3, if you have never gardened before, if you don't have any sort of working garden yet, if you don't have any idea what you're going to be starting with, I'm going to highly suggest that you start making your grocery lists physically, writing them down, and that you also tape a paper to your fridge and write down the things that you buy, use some of, and end up having to throw away a large amount of. And the reason that I say this is because, for example, especially fresh herbs, a lot of the time I noticed when I was planning my garden, Grizzly, we will get to that in a moment. We will talk about like preseason fertilizing, postseason fertilizing, picking what it is, what kind of extra nutrients you might need, that sort of thing. We will get there. Trust me. So when you're setting up these grocery lists, the grocery lists that you write down will give you an idea of what sort of produce you purchase, both canned, frozen, dried, etc. But your throwaway list will tell you if there is a thing that you don't tend to use in the quantities that you will get at the store. Like, for example, when I was planting my garden, I noticed that we often bought bunches of parsley and of cilantro, and I'd use half of it for a recipe, but the other half I wouldn't finish off. Well, when I started growing my own fresh parsley and cilantro, I could just go out and clip as much as I needed, and now I'm not wasting, money on an entire bunch when I only needed half of it. Same with things like basil, same with things like oregano. Herbs, I've noticed often you don't need as much as the whole pack of the fresh herb, and if you don't have an herb dryer or something already, like an Excalibur, not one of the cheaper sort of circular dryers that are good for fruit, then it can be very hard to preserve that extra. So it's better to kind of know ahead of time, this is what I'm buying a lot of, and this is what I'm using a lot of. Now, the second thing you need to consider is with your growing zone, what is going to grow easily that is fairly expensive or that tastes a heck of a lot better when you harvest it yourself. Now, the reason that I say this is in my state, for example, in Washington, and if Gaius is around, or Tara can actually probably crack this joke too. If Gaius is around, he'll back me on this. Anybody who buys blackberries in Washington gets laughed at. And part of the reason for that is because they basically grow wild every freaking where. Like, you can't kill them. They're weeds in your garden that just invade everything. And so every August, a lot of people will just go and they will go by the side of the road or out in the boonies, and they'll collect these big baskets of blackberries and just spread them out on cookie sheets and freeze them, make jam, make preserves, make all kinds of stuff. But like, you can get them practically for free. So like, blackberries are an example of something that grows extraordinarily well every freaking where. You probably shouldn't plant them in your own backyard, but like, the point being is up here, that's something that is very good for us to grow. Another example of something that also tastes a heck of a lot better, but may not be that expensive, is actually tomatoes. Now, anybody who's ever bought Romas at a store versus picked them off their own plants and knows what I'm talking about. A high quality, very good, especially heirloom sauce, paste, or canning tomato, they're going to have so much more flavor than the stuff you get at the store. Like, it is absolutely crazy how different the flavor is. So, in my opinion, growing them, even though now we've got a greenhouse so we can start our own starts, but before we used to get bare fruit tomato plants, even though it was a little bit expensive to get them, they taste so much better that it was worth actually growing them. Because the Romas that you get at the store, or even slicing tomatoes that you get at the store, they are going to be green or very close to green, maybe yellow-orange, so that they're firm when they're shipped, and then they gas ripen them to make them look red, but they're still very sour. Versus the ones you pick on your own plants are going to be extremely sweet and a lot more flavorful. So, yeah, Victoria, store-bought tomatoes taste like disappointment. They really do. So, that's another big consideration, is what is going to be extremely easy to grow. Tomatoes are not easy to grow here. They're high maintenance, and we'll talk about that when we start talking about getting varietals, because doing research for your growing zone and figuring out what's going to grow well there, as well as what kind of time commitment you're willing to put in. Tomatoes, if you live in a place like where I do, might not be a time commitment that is worth your time. If you want a decent harvest for putting up, you might actually have a better luck with a CSA for tomatoes if you live in Washington and don't have a lot of time to micromanage your plants, because here, because it's so wet, it's very easy for like dirt to splash up onto the tomatoes, which then encourages things like rust mold, which can really hurt your harvest. So you have to very heavily watch your tomatoes here, especially indeterminate ones. And again, we'll talk about that in a second when we talk about seed choice. So when you're thinking about tomatoes, they are high maintenance plants here in Washington state. However, they might not be in some place like California, especially the southern parts of California where you get a lot less rain and a lot less humidity. So look up your growing zone, research what it is that grows well in your area, research what you eat a lot of and what's going to taste a lot better or is very expensive. Berries are a good example of things that tend to be very expensive and grow well in most areas, especially June-bearing strawberries are a fantastic investment for a lot of people. Dwarf fruit trees, if you have a yard, can be a very good investment. They tend to yield for 5 to 7 years. They tend to not take up a ton of space. You can trellis them to make them a lot more productive. They can be a good investment if you plan on putting up preserves and things like that, or if you go through a lot of fruit. So let's talk a little bit about seed choice and sourcing plants. If you are doing square foot gardening or container gardening, so I'm talking to folks who've got balconies or folks who have smaller yards, researching your varietals is going to be really, really important. Just because like Mel Brooks's square foot gardening book is 3/4 hype and advertisement, but it still is very useful. You can get a lot of that information for free online if you go digging. But if you think carefully about the space requirements you have, you can kind of subvert some of the square foot gardening rules a little bit. For example, if you get bush zucchinis, you can actually plant 2 of them diagonally side by side in the center of your boxes. The way that square foot gardening works is you sort of draw this grid where each little square in your 4x4 becomes a 1 foot by 1 foot square. And within that, you can plant a certain amount of plants. Now, this is where researching companion planting can come in a lot of handy. Depending on how many of those boxes you're going to have, and depending on what sort of consumption your grocery list says that you do, you're going to need to think very carefully about what the most efficient use of your space is going to be. Whether you are prioritizing flavor, or whether you're prioritizing saving money, or whether you are prioritizing putting stuff up. Because again, that's going to change the way that you plan your garden. Also, if you are planning on putting things up, you need to consider the method of putting things up that you are using. For example, if you are thinking about primarily freezing, you might want to get yourself a chest freezer, and you might want to investigate what sort of chest freezer is going to work really well for you. Again, especially if you've got around a 1/4 acre, because you'll be shocked at how fast those things fill up. But also, you'll be surprised at how much of a challenge it can be, even with one, to get things frozen in large enough quantities without them getting stuck together that you can actually put them into, say, freezer bags to put them up over a long period of time. When you've got, say, 7 heads of cauliflower all coming in at once, if you're trying to freeze cauliflower and you've got a very small chest freezer, you're only going to be able to fit 1 or 2 cookie sheets at a time full of cauliflower, like deflorated cauliflower, on those cookie sheets. So it's going to take you a while to process them. You're going to have to use some of it up then and there. So think very carefully about whether you are trying to grow for flavor, or if you're trying to grow for saving money, or you're trying to grow for putting them up, or are you trying to grow, as Victoria just said, for nutrients? Because if you're trying to grow for nutrients, you have to fertilize your soil a little differently. The other big thing to think about when you're choosing seeds is equipment. For example, let's go back to tomatoes. There are 2 different kinds of tomatoes if you do research on the plant. There are determinate tomatoes and there are indeterminate tomatoes. Determinate tomatoes are great for people who are growing gardens in pots, and for square foot gardeners who don't have tomato cages, like large ones, because determinate plants only get to a certain size. Now, these plants are a little bit lower maintenance. You don't want to trim them or you will lose harvest, because they only get to a certain size. Genetically, that's just the way they are. Indeterminate tomatoes are monster plants. You want to get some heavy-duty, large tomato cages to cage the living heck out of those things, give them lots and lots of support, and you are going to have to constantly micromanage the bastards, because they are evil. They will expand to take up your entire garden. They grow tons and tons of extra branches. They are extremely prone to disease. Even if they're disease-resistant varietals, they're still going to be more prone to disease than the determinate varieties. And they also yield massive, massive amounts. If you are going to be putting tomatoes up and you have a larger space, then indeterminate tomatoes and heavy-duty, big, square, 5 to 6 foot tall tomato cages are going to be your best friend. That said, you are also going to have to micromanage those plants. You're going to have to trim all of the lower branches off. You're going to have to trim off what are known as suckers, which are these little branches that grow in between the main branches and the stem of your tomato plants. And you're going to have to watch the heck out of them as they grow to make sure that they are still being supported and that you move branches to stick out in between the cages. So, indeterminate tomatoes can be trained to espalier. That said, though, they also, if you're going to be doing that, you need to clip off the earliest flowers on them. They are, again, indeterminate tomatoes are their own beast. I love them. That's most of what I grow, but they are a lot to manage. They are a lot to manage. So when you're thinking about what you're going to grow, if you're thinking about, say, growing green beans, you're going to want to consider getting trellises of some kind. If you want to grow shelling beans, something very similar. If you want to grow cucumbers or certain vining squash, you're also probably going to want to trellis them. Melons have a tendency to need trellising, but also remember, melons take up a lot of space, and you'll usually get 5 to 6 fruit at most if you take perfect care of your plants from melons. So if you really love melons and you eat a lot of fruit salad over the summer, they're going to be a good use of a certain amount of space, but you probably only want to plant 1 or 2 plants because they take up a ton of space and you don't get a ton of yield from them. If you want to put stuff up, melons are probably not your best choice. Most melons don't freeze particularly well. So if you want to grow a lot of determinate plants, as Kirsten just said, you should probably be prepared to put those plants up. Determinate plants, there are a number of determinate plants that can be earlier, where you can use them in the early parts of the season. And again, we're kind of at the point where we're starting to talk about seed choice. When you're choosing seeds, another thing you need to consider before we get too deep into the determinate and indeterminate tomato thing, which I can talk about forever because tomatoes are their own beast, you also need to consider whether or not you want to save your seeds. Because if you do, you should not be buying hybrid seeds to begin with, or hybrid plants. Hybrid seeds are genetically modified, or they're crossbred. They are guaranteed to work the way they do for 1 season. However, the seeds you save are not going to be the same kind of plants as the seeds that you planted. They're just not. Heirloom varieties, on the other hand, are generally open pollinated. They are also generally the kind where if you plant all of the same in the same area and your neighbors aren't planting a whole bunch of, say, tomatoes or whatever it is that you're planting, then you will most likely get seeds that are very similar if you save them. So if you are growing heirloom sauce tomatoes, you're most likely going to get more heirloom sauce tomatoes if you let your seeds over ripen. There's a wonderful book called Seed to Seed that has all kinds of instructions on saving seeds. They're wonderful. I highly recommend checking it out. But for anything you want to save seeds on, you do not want to get hybrid plants. It'll say F1 on the seed packet somewhere, or on the information little stick that's in your start plants. Or if you're looking at a seed catalog online, like I buy most of mine from Territorial, which is a company down in Oregon that specializes in growing seeds and plants for the Pacific Northwest, because we have a very special climate up here that can murder the majority of everything. It's a shock that you can grow tomatoes up here at all, because again, it's very wet weather. So we have very disease resistant plants that we grow from this company. There's nothing sponsored about that. That's just the company I get my stuff from. But if you're going to be considering saving your own seeds, make sure you are getting heirloom seeds. They don't have to be organic. That's seeds being organic or not doesn't make a lot of difference, but the seeds being heirloom does. So, putting food by is a good example. Another one is actually called Keeping the Harvest. Keeping the Harvest is another book that I'm going to suggest. But when you're considering also what you're going to put up versus what you're not, consider the way in which you use your food. For example, part of the reason why I can so many tomatoes as opposed to just drying them is that I don't tend to use a ton of sun-dried tomatoes in my cooking, but I have noticed that in my groceries, I go through a lot of diced tomatoes in canned form. I just use a lot of that in my cooking in general. So canning a whole bunch of marinara, which I also go through, especially in the winter, they they are something that show up on my grocery list all the time. They're something that I know for a fact I'm going to use up. So canning them is a good idea. When you're selecting seeds also, so we have talked about space considerations, bushing varieties of things like squash, cucumber, zucchini, etc. are going to be great for space considerations. If you want to grow zucchini or cucumbers or anything like that on your deck, you're going to want to get bushing varieties. Bushing varieties of beans are also going to be very good for that sort of thing. If you, however, are growing on your deck and you want to grow something like, say, green beans or peas, that's why I suggested having hanging baskets and purchasing reusable hanging baskets that you can get liners and things for, because letting them hang down can be just as good as trellising, and you can collect a pretty large amount that way. So that's why I suggest those sorts of things. When you are considering your growing season, you also want to consider whether you are going to go for, say, a liquid fertilizer, or if you want to do a till-in fertilizer. So till-in fertilizers are things like bone meal, or it's not limestone. I'm trying to remember what the alternative. There's a vegan alternative to bone meal. I have a tendency to use eggshells personally for my calcium stuff. I save my eggs, I will bake them and then grind them up, and then we till those into the soil at the end of the year each year so that it has all of winter to get rained on and become more bioavailable. But if you want to use a till-in fertilizer, things like manure, things like calcium, that sort of thing, you're going to actually want to put that stuff in the year before when you set those boxes up. You're going to want to set your boxes up probably in the fall of the previous year, and you're going to want to till all those fertilizers in. Lime, thank you, Nix. Rock phosphate is another example, but lime is what I was thinking of, actually. So if you want to, say, put fertilizers in, you're going to want to put them in the year before. And the reason for that is it takes a lot of time for that stuff to become bioavailable to your soil, especially if you live in an area like mine where there's acid rain. That's going to help you get that calcium into the soil. But if you till it in at the beginning of the year, your plants can't get to it. So if you till it in the year before, you're going to get a lot more out of it than you will if you till it that year. Now, granted, if you get a really good quality soil to begin with, you're going to have a lot less need for that, but every garden needs fertilizer. Every garden. Even if you till in fertilizer, you are still going to need some kind of fertilizer throughout the year. It's just going to happen. Like that's a thing you need to consider. In terms of equipment, so we've talked about tomato cages, we've talked about trellises, we've talked about, say, hanging baskets, which, again, vertical gardening, that can do a ton for your yields. You absolutely want to consider it. If you've got a deck, grow stuff on your deck. You know, like moving more delicate plants that are likely to get overrun, like herbs and stuff, up to a balcony or deck is a really good way to save space and to make sure that you'll actually go out and harvest them, because a lot of people will plant herbs and then they get buried in their gardens and they never go get them. If you put them on pots on your deck, you've got a reason to go get them, right? So that's a big thing. When you're considering your seeds as well, Grizzly actually brought up a really good point, which is there are cultivars that are going to be better for your specific grow zone, which we talked about earlier. You know, when you're planting your garden, make sure you check your grow zone, find out what's going to be good for there. Different companies, more localized companies, will often specialize in heirloom varieties that grow well in your area. I highly recommend doing research on what specific companies near you grow seeds, because often things like Bonnie, things like Burpee, that your typical plants that you can very easily get access to, they're not grown for every zone. They're generally grown for the Midwest. If you're talking about the South, you guys have very different considerations than we do here up north. And even within your state, you can have subzones, because if you cross the mountains, you are no longer in the same grow zone that you are here. So think carefully about what it is you are going to use, and make sure you read your seed packets and make sure that you research the company to make sure that the place that you're buying from, the seeds that you are getting, work well for your grow zone. So that is a big consideration. Another thing that you're going to want to consider is what direction your light comes from. For example, my backyard is amazing. My house is east-west facing, and my backyard is in the west. So it gets full sun damn near all day. But there's a large patch of shade that is caused by my deck that makes it a partial shade zone for a good chunk of the day until about maybe 4 to 5 in the afternoon because of the angling of the sun here. So that area I decided to designate while I was doing my garden planning for my backyard as the place where I grow in the springtime, my lettuce and my green beans that are shade loving. And in the summertime, I grow cauliflower and broccoli there because I have heat resistant broccoli varieties that, because our summers generally don't get that hot, we don't usually get bolting. We can grow broccoli damn near year round here. So that will be a big consideration, thinking about that, but also think about the plants that are going to get tall and the kind of shade that they are going to cast when you are planning where you're going to be putting your boxes. Because, for example, with my tomatoes, I have 12 big, massive tomato cages. By the end of the summer season, those massive tomato cages are filled with big tomatoes. They're dumping tomatoes all over everything. You guys have seen the 20, 30, 40 pounds that I brought in at a time. They're casting a ton of shade. The boxes behind there, mostly shade-loving plants. And plants that can tolerate partial shade, because I had to plan around the fact that those bastards are going to get huge, and that's just the way it is. So when you are planning around that, consider what direction your sun is facing and what plants enjoy the shade versus those that don't. Also, especially if you're square foot gardening, you want to consider multiple uses for a single space. For example, you're not going to get a green bean harvest all the way through the summer. It usually cuts off around June. That said, if your last spring frost date is toward the end of April, early May, like it is here, that might be a really good time if you've been growing tomato starts, say, in your house, to bring your tomatoes out and maybe plant them in a similar area. Or you could pull them a little bit early because you're not going to, your harvest is going to wane toward the end of the season, and you can plant some summer crops there, like during that month when it's actually going to do well for them. So remember that your space can be used for multiple things over the course of a season. You don't have to let plants exhaust themselves. You can pull them at the end of the height of their season and put new plants in there that are going to continue to be productive, especially if you decide to till more soil in. Another consideration is if you want beans to, say, fix nitrogen, you have to inoculate. So you need to make sure you learn how to do that. And you need to make sure that your beans that you're planting there are actually the kind that will respond to that, because some of them don't. Lots of research, lots of prep, lots of planning. I highly recommend for companion planting and such, because some things don't do so well together. For example, if you plant a whole bunch of broccoli and a whole bunch of cabbages and a whole bunch of cauliflower, those are all from the same family. If you plant them all together in square foot gardening boxes, you're going to attract a lot of pests because they're all from the same family. That's not the best idea. But carrots and tomatoes do really, really well together, because the carrots don't mind the little bit of shade that the tomatoes provide, and they also help chase away each other's pests. There's a book called Carrots Love Tomatoes. I highly recommend checking that out and going through that for companion planting. It will teach you a ton about what can grow well together and help you plan your boxes to get the most out of them through each of the seasons. So if you are a spoonie and you have to conserve spoons, perennials and year-round stuff, like I said, if you want tomatoes, for example, determinate plants are going to be much better for you. If you want squash and the like, you're not going to want to grow that in a really humid area because you might have to spray it to keep the powder mildew, which nearly killed our plants this year, and such, out of the way. But if you, cabbage moths, that's absolutely, cabbage moths and slugs. Victoria says cabbage moth breeding ground. That's what I was talking about. Carpathia says, I don't know why I'm here. I killed a cactus from underwatering. I shouldn't be trusted with plants. Carpathia, do the kind of research you do on other things you love, and you can take care of plants. Plants are not that complicated. It's just a matter of learning the things you need to learn about the stuff you plan to grow. Now, I recommend kind of getting into gardening gradually. We didn't install all 20 of our boxes at once. We built them over time, and we got better at growing different things. If you're going to be building your boxes for multiple years, crop rotation is going to be really important. You don't want to grow tomatoes in the same box every year. You want to move them around if you can. The reason for that being that, again, diseases and stuff will cultivate in those soils eventually, and your plants will get more and more and more likely to sort of spring up, because if they get infected one year, that's still going to be in the ground, etc. This also happens with things like cherry drop flies. This happens with certain kinds of caterpillars that will emerge like from the ground. White flies do it as well. So if you don't want to deal with pests, you're going to want to make sure that A, you don't plant all things from the same families together in your boxes, and B, you're going to want to make sure that you move your plants around from year to year. So now you're growing your plants, you're doing amazing. You've just brought in your first harvest. You're not thinking about putting that up yet. When you bring your first harvest in, it's generally not a lot. It's usually better to cook with it at the beginning part of the season. It's usually toward the end of the season that you get to canning season. Now, keep in mind, toward the end of the season means whichever season you're on. So in the spring, toward the end of the season, you get a massive harvest of green beans. That's when it's time to put all the green beans up. When you've got a massive harvest of peas, that's the time you're going to be shucking your peas and putting them in your freezer, right? So you kind of need to plan your schedule a little bit if you want to try to put things up around how long that is going to take. So as far as those considerations go, if you want to put things up, you need to plan around what season those things are going to be ready for, and also how you're going to store them. Which brings me to storage, putting things up, and that entire process. So there are 5 main methods of storage. The most common that people think of are canning, freezing, basic refrigeration, drying, and the last is actually what's known as root cellaring. Now, root cellaring is not an option for everybody. Some people who have a garage that is not drafty can use that as a root cellar. Most people would have to dig for one. You have to get special permits if you live in a city. That's a little bit of a pain. But if you have a garage that's not drafty and you don't open and close it all the time to put your car in it, it's not a space that gets used, it's not, adjusted for living and such, then that can actually function as a root cellar if it's dry and if you can protect your crops from, say, rats and mice and things that might get into your garage. So let's talk about the different things that put up well for each of these methods. Now, the majority of everything you're going to want to grow is probably going to be best frozen or root cellared. Some things dry well, like herbs dry well, tomatoes dry well. You can dry most anything, but not everything preserves its flavor extraordinarily well through drying. So unless you're a hiker and you frequently are used to eating dehydrated food and know how to, Elspeth, most of the things that you would root cellar are going to be tubers. You don't really need to worry about the summer heat. It's usually the fall and winter time is when you're going to be bringing those crops in that would be root cellared. You don't generally store things in a root cellar that are going to be stored in the summer heat. So when you're talking about putting things up, for root cellaring, you're looking mostly at tubers. You're looking at potatoes, you're looking at onions, which you're looking at garlic, you're looking at carrots, basically things that are generally in the ground, tough, and probably need to be peeled before you eat them. Often the best way to store these, if you have a root cellar that is not drafty and doesn't get below freezing in the wintertime, the best way to store them is going to be in a large, crate, usually wooden, filled with sawdust. And you're going to want to layer them in sawdust. That way, if it starts to spoil, the moisture gets absorbed by the sawdust and doesn't spoil the rest of the batch. Onions can be stored in braids, which, if one of them spoils, it sticks out. You can just pull it off. Garlic can also be stored in braids. If you want to braid onions and garlic, there are instructionals for that online. Make sure you get extra twine to reinforce them, but it's a great way to store them once you have them. Carrots can also be stored in sawdust, etc. Now, if you're talking about drying, like I said, unless you're a hiker and you know how to construct meals out of dehydrated foods and you know how to kind of put those things together, apart from tomatoes, which all of us love sun-dried tomatoes, and grapes, if you grow grapes, if you're in a climate where you can grow them well, which makes raisins, or if you want to make fruit leather, drying or dried herbs, that's kind of most of what you'd use drying for. You can dry other things. It's just not the absolute best way to do it. The next method is canning, and canning is a whole thing. So you're going to get a lot of really bad advice about canning online. There's going to be a lot of people who be like, well, my grandpappy and my grandmammy decided to do all of the canning things, and I've got these old recipes and nobody ever died from them. Okay, well, great. Still, there's A, the way the composition of our food has changed, and B, they're lucky because botulism is horrible. Now, for those of you who are a little bit squeamish, what I'm about to describe is going to suck. So give me about 5 minutes to talk about the horrors of botulism, because I'm not trying to scare you too badly, but you should know about this. Botulism comes from botulinum bacteria. Now, you've got botulinum bacteria on your skin right now, in spore form. Like, it's everywhere all the time. It's on your hands, it's in your face, it's inside your body. It doesn't cause problems until you put it in an airless environment where it then activates and can grow. This is where canning that is done improperly can become a problem, because improperly canned foods that are not acidic enough, and even tomatoes cannot be acidic enough at times, can facilitate the growth of this bacteria. It will eat anything it can get its hands on. Oh boy, it is just not a good idea to water bath can anything other than jams and jellies, and if you really must, tomatoes, but only if you add citric acid or use bottled lemon juice to increase the acidity, because not all tomatoes are going to be acidic enough to not cause problems. I personally recommend anybody who wants to can, anybody at all, get at least a 16-quart Presto pressure canner. They double as water bath canners for making jams and stuff, but they are incredible because of the fact that pressure canning effectively, if your pressure gauge is calibrated properly, and most nearby, like most universities in most states will actually recalibrate your pressure canner's gauge for you every year if you take them in. They'll have their department, their agricultural department will do it for you, a lot of them. I'm talking about jarring, Astrid. Steel cans, generally, you don't have to worry about botulism unless they're dented. There's a whole different process for industrial canning. But for home canning, you want to destroy those botulinum spores, because if you don't, botulism is horrendous. It paralyzes your body slowly, is what it does. Your face will start to droop, and then eventually it starts to get into your hands. It damages your nerves. Botulinum toxin is fucking terrifying. When in doubt, always pressure can. Just always do it. It's healthier, it's safer. It is far more likely to be safe for you. Okay? Just I pressure can damn near everything. The only time I water bath can is when I'm making jams and jellies. I even pressure can my tomatoes, and I just I just showed off a giant load of marinara sauce that I made out of 30 pounds of tomatoes that came in. That was pressure canned, even though it's acidic, because I wanted to make damn sure that it did not mean that it did not develop anything. So yeah, J. Stockman, Botox is indeed made from small doses of botulinum toxin. It's used to paralyze the nerves in the face to stiffen that to then reduce wrinkles. That's what it's for. That's botulinum toxin is no fucking joke. You don't want it. Now, for the germaphobes in the room, don't worry. Botulinum spores that are not active and not in an airless environment are more or less harmless. And actually, this is not an excuse to do shitty canning practices. But if you're worried about something that you canned and there's not any sort of signs that it's actually spoiled, but you're still worried, you can boil something for 10 to 15 minutes while stirring it that you canned, and that can destroy the botulinum toxin and kill the bacteria. If you cook your food thoroughly, you don't have to worry about that. Slow cookers, however, do not get up to a high enough temperature to destroy botulinum toxins, so make sure you boil your food before you put it in slow cooker if you put it up yourself and you're worried about it. TLDR, though, if you want to can your green beans, you want to can your peas, you want to can your carrots, you want to can your artichoke hearts, you want to can your tomatoes, any of that stuff, anything other pretty much than jams and jellies made out of fruit, get yourself a freaking pressure canner. Just do it. But also, make sure you get a book on canning and preserving, or go to the USDA's website or the website for there is a like Society for Canning or something like that is the name of it. It's a .edu website. Use tested recipes. Use tested recipes. Always. Always, 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 always use tested recipes. The reason for that is, again, there are certain things that you can't can and know for a fact are going to be safe. Any dairy, for example, you can't can. Cooking oil, you want to limit heavily if you're planning on canning things. Like with my marinara, for 30 pounds of tomatoes, that was barely even a quarter cup of oil for that whole big gigantic batch for 9 pints worth of sauce. Why? Because of the fact that oil can go rancid in cans. Even though it's been put up, even though it's been heated, it can still go rancid. So get the Bell Blue Book or the Ball preserving guides or the USDA preserving guides. There's another book called Keeping the Harvest that has a number of recipes in it. These need to be USDA tested recipes because you need to know that you are processing your cans long enough to process through the whole center of the can so there's no risk of developing botulism. This is serious stuff. You'll find a lot of websites where people will just put up home canning recipes and you won't know if they're safe or not. And it's really just not a healthy thing to just can whatever it is you damn well please without having any idea if it's actually going to be safe. Please stay safe, guys. All right, so let's talk about freezing. Freezing. The majority of the food that you grow, you're probably going to freeze. Most fruit, unless you're making it into jams and jellies and preserves, is going to be frozen. Broccoli florets, cauliflower florets, that's going to be put in your freezer. Green beans, actually, if you prep them, can be put in your freezer pretty easily. The most common way to freeze is to take like a cookie sheet, large sort of flat sheet, lay freshly washed produce out on that sheet, let it freeze overnight, then gather it up and put it into a freezer bag. You're going to want to buy specifically the freezer bags. They're thicker. They prevent freezer burn. It's going to be a lot better for you. You also want to make sure that when you can or freeze that you write the date that you put it into the freezer or the date of harvest on it so you know how old things are so you can use up your older cans, especially if you've been doing this for a while. It's generally safer to know when you actually put stuff up. Fermentation, fermentation is a whole thing. You really need to be careful with fermentation, things like kimchi and sauerkraut and stuff. Make sure, again, that you're following tested recipes and that you make sure to sterilize it, especially stuff like sauerkraut that have bioactive cultures. Sterilize it before sealing it if you're going to be storing it long term. Now, kimchi generally that isn't done with, but sauerkraut, once you fermented it for a certain amount of time, usually gets put through the canner. Same with things like pickles. If you put it through the canner afterwards, make sure you follow a tested recipe so that you know for a fact. Yeah. Astrid, unfortunately, people that are older, there were a lot more deaths from botulism before the USDA stuff. You really do want to make sure you use more modern tested recipes. Out-of-date books can get you killed. They actually can. So make sure you do that. Lillian, it is generally not the best idea to freeze root vegetables. You can sweet potatoes and pumpkin in chunks. You don't want to puree them, but you can sweet potatoes and pumpkin in chunks. You can also can potatoes. Freezing them, you can do it. It's possible, but it's usually better if you're freezing to cook things first. For example, you can like pre-cook French fries and then freeze them. You get really unpleasant textures from frozen tubers and the like. I don't recommend it personally. It's not the best way to preserve things. Some things just don't preserve very well in the first place. Celery is a good example of that. You want to kind of use it. Again, herbs, you want to dry them. Otherwise, they're not going to preserve very well. Kind of use them as you get them or leave them on the plants. Do not puree squash if you're going to can it. Absolutely don't. It is too dense to actually cook all the way through in the canner. You can get botulism from that. Do not puree squash if you're going to can it. You can puree squash and freeze it, but do not puree squash and can it. It is not safe. USDA guidelines recommend against that. So as far as other methods of putting up, refrigeration, obviously some things do last really well in the freezer. If you pick it yourself, it's going to last a lot longer in your freezer. However, I highly recommend researching what goes best in crisper drawers and what does not. Because some things, if you put them in the crisper drawer, are going to do significantly better than if you put them just on the shelves in your fridge, because your fridge is going to dehydrate things. It constantly is going to be pumping out the excess humidity in it from having food storage. Putting stuff in the crisper drawers, it's not going to dehydrate as bad as the things that are up on your shelves. So some things like root veggies, like carrots, do better when they're refrigerated if you're not going to be storing them in a root cellar. Those go well in crisper drawers. Same with things like bell peppers. But certain other stuff, like say if you're putting your cabbage in your fridge, you can put that up on your shelves. So research where things go well in your fridge. You can preserve your harvest for a long time. But yes, Kirsten, you can freeze pureed squash, but do not can it. It is not a good idea. The USDA, as far as I know, the last canning guide that I just got that was updated for last year said you can can potatoes, but only in chunks, not if they are pureed or if they're in like mashed potato form. Summer squash can still, summer squash can be canned. It just isn't a very good idea because it's squishy. Like, the texture of it is bad. So just, it's probably not a good idea. Like, you can freeze summer squash, but don't can it. So while we're on that topic, things like pre-made soups and the like, again, if you have a favorite soup recipe, it might not be safe to can. Make sure you check a canning guide, see if you can find something similar. If you can't, it just might not be something that you can put up to can. See if it'll do well frozen. There are certain things that just, like, for example, tomatoes, unless you process them somehow, cook them first, tomatoes don't do very well frozen. Like, you can do it, but it's just not the best that way. But if you process them into, say, tomato soup, you can freeze that for a certain amount of time and it'll be okay. So really consider when you are stashing stuff, make sure that you have the space and that you're considering what it is that you are going to be preserving. And remember that some things just don't preserve all that well. They just don't. That's okay. That means you have to enjoy that as a seasonal thing, and it'll give you more of an appreciation for it. So first off, Reality Hex, I would highly suggest getting a more updated canning book. But yes, actually, canning meat is a thing. That is a thing that people can do. There are very specific rules around it. So I recommend getting an updated canning guide. You can still do that. There's a lot of recipes for it. It's just you got to be really, really careful with the process. And that's the other big thing. If you're going to be doing canning specifically, read through the process. Do not skip a single step. Not a single one. Make sure that you boil your jars or put them through the sanitizer cycle on your dishwasher. Hot pack, boil the stuff for as long as it tells you to. Cook things as thoroughly as it tells you to. Put it through the whole process. Vent your canner if it tells you to do that. Mine says you have to vent it for 10 minutes before you put the gauge on it. Get your canner's gauge checked every year. Follow the entire process. Be safe. Be careful. Just because somebody else ignored the canning instructions and didn't die doesn't mean that they didn't roll the dice with their own life. Botulism is serious business. You don't want botulism. You just don't. Just don't. I'm going to stress that over and over. Just don't. Okay? Okay. So we've now talked about planting your garden. We've now talked about picking your plants. We've now talked about figuring out what you're going to use the most of and what you're not. Trust me, you might think you know this stuff intuitively. You probably don't. Write all that stuff down. Make your plan. You'll thank yourself later when you're actually like muddling through the harvest. You're putting your food up. What does all of this have to do with the gods? Now, I'm not going to say that anybody has to garden to get closer to the gods. That would be a completely ridiculous thing. But what I am going to say is that a lot of what our ancestors of faith understood about the gods had to do with seasonality, had to do with how they affected the way that plants grow and die, the way that animals grow and die. Now, most people aren't going to be keeping backyard farms either. They can't. That's just not really a space consideration for a lot of us, especially if you want to grow plants. If you got a 1/4 acre, you might not have room for plants and chickens, and also the vet bills for chickens. There's a whole thing around that. I found, personally at least, that my relationship with Demeter, with Persephone, with Hyades, with all of the gods really, has improved greatly as I've grown things and offered to them, because not only does putting up your harvest and growing food give you an entire new extra set of offerings. First fruit offerings are a whole thing. They were very important in ancient Greece. They were very important in a lot of different cultures. But I've noticed that the food I grow myself feels so much more like an offering because I know there's only so much of it that I'm going to get. Like, if you can go to the grocery store and buy a whole new bottle of wine, and you are, say, in a financial situation where that's not going to be a huge financial burden for you, because I know some of us in my audience, I know that some of you guys are in a much worse financial situation than I am. But if, say, getting a new bottle of wine, like even an inexpensive one, is not going to be a huge portion of your income, it can feel so much more like a sacrifice to take that first red ripe tomato off of your plant and burn it in your backyard, or offer it and bury it, or whatever it is that you use to do your offering to Demeter, to whatever gods you ask for help with your harvest. You feel that in that moment so much more than if you went to the store and you bought it. I can't describe it apart from the weight of that decision hits so much harder when you take your first zucchini and you burn it or you bury it. You can appreciate the weight of the offerings that were given, maybe not to the level of the ancients, because to the ancients that sacrifice was, as Beethel talked about in his video on offerings, the potential that was being given away. You know, the seeds for that tomato, the food for your family, you can't use that anymore. You know, when they sacrificed animals, that was the potential for them. It's not nearly as life or death with these offerings as it was for the ancestors. But when you are growing a large portion of what you're eating, or even any portion at all of that hard work that went into making that plant as healthy as it is hits you in that moment. When you offer that to the gods, it feels like you are giving something of value, in the same way that, for those of you who have done devotional offerings, if you've ever given a votive offering that you made yourself, the weight of that gift hits you all at once when you realize you can never use that votive offering for anything else again. It now belongs to the gods. All that labor, all that love, it now belongs to them. But also, gardens give you a lot more of an insight into what the ancients were talking about when they talk about the gifts of wealth and blessings of various gods. My appreciation of Zeus deepened greatly when we had a 2-week-long drought where it just didn't rain all through the summer, and I prayed and prayed and offered, and suddenly we had this massive rain that helped very much revitalize my garden, for one thing, because rain just does something magic that, like, watering doesn't. For any of you who garden, you could back me up on this. But it helped me appreciate so much more what people who didn't have flowing water and irrigation systems must have felt, right? It's huge. It causes you to stop and appreciate the seasons. It causes you to stop and appreciate the work that you've done. And it also causes you to stop and appreciate the incredible gift of things like grocery stores, where you can go and buy things that you would never be able to eat. Like oranges, lemons, I would never be able to have them up here. Ever. They just don't grow here. But on top of that, for those of you who make kathiskos, which are like gift jars, you can make kathiskos jars out of, for Hellenists in my audience, these are jars that were offerings to Zeus that were preserved. You can make those out of your own fruit and other things that come out of your garden. And that's an offering from your own property. So, like, for those of you who do magic, there is something special also about growing your own herbs and other ingredients for your spells. Like, I am not a magician anymore, but I used to do magic. And there is, as somebody who was trained, like, within my own tradition, from my tribe. There is something sacred about having cared for that plant yourself and harvesting that plant yourself as opposed to going out and buying it. Now, again, I'm not saying that these things cannot be achieved at all with store-bought methods. If you don't have your own space to do this in, if you don't have the capability or the spoons or the mental capacity or the mental willpower or whatever it is, if you are struggling or you don't have the desire even to do this, you shouldn't be forced to. But I am making the argument for people who are interested. This is why it is worth it. This is why it's worth it. Because when you put that work in yourself, the first time you offer your first fruits, the first time that you give up that first tomato that you picked, or that first strawberry, or that first zucchini, the full weight of what it meant to offer comes crashing down on your shoulders. And the amount of and depth of closeness that you feel, especially to the agricultural gods, I can't give you words that can describe it. I can only urge you to try to experience it for yourself. Because I consider farming and putting up harvest, especially connections with Hestia, when you're cooking with your own food, like Hestia and other hearth gods, the connection that I feel with her when I'm cooking my own food, I can't describe that either, but it's there. And it's incredible. It is so incredible. It's beautiful. It is absolutely beautiful. So I highly recommend, if you've never done it before and you have the space, you have the desire, do a ton of research first. Make sure you research the varietals you want to grow. Make sure you research your seasons. Make sure you research what the best time to plant in your area is. Talk to other gardeners if you can, especially if you have your own land a little bit. Even if it's just a 1/4 acre, you can grow a ton. Try it out. Because the cycle of offerings and the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of your food itself, but also the weight of giving those food offerings to the gods, it means so much more when you did it yourself. It is incredible. And I wish that I could say more than that. I really, really do. I really do. Tea made from homegrown herbs is a wonderful offering. That said, though, if you are a Hellenist, make sure that the one that you offer to the gods stays to the gods, and make sure that the one that you drink for yourself is for yourself. Unless you are syncretizing with a tradition in which offerings were consumed, it's not a good idea to consume Hellenic offerings. It just was not done. So I highly, highly recommend trying this out. Like I said at the beginning of this, if you guys have any questions, now's the time. But remember also that you don't have to offer what is traditional to the gods. You can make an incense out of aromatic herbs that you grew yourself and offer that instead of frankincense if you need to, because it's an offering that came off of your own effort. Just because Demeter is a grain god doesn't mean that you can't give her tomatoes or zucchini as first fruits. She's the goddess that ensures that all of your harvest is bountiful. Thank her. Consider her, pray to her, talk to her as you are working on your garden or whatever your main harvest and planting gods are. Hydes controls the seeds until they sprout. Pray to him when you first plant under the epithet Pluton. Think about the gods throughout the process and the roles in which they play. If you are a pagan, if this is a deepening practice for you, think about that. Thank the gods for the rains when they come. Thank the gods for the sunny days. Consider the role in which they play from seed to plate, and you will find your relationship with them grows deeper as the days go by. And if you do a lot of planning, and you do a lot of research, and you get all of your ducks in a row, then you get to enjoy some of the most delicious, incredible food that you will ever try. Everything from purple green beans to yin yang beans to moon and stars, which are purple and yellow watermelons, to cantaloupe that tastes like papaya, to the biggest, most succulent strawberries you've ever seen, to heirloom aroma tomatoes that are so sweet that you can barely distinguish them from berries. Yes, Astrid, purple green beans. I'm growing them next year again. So if you want to do something like this, make sure you consider very carefully what it is that you want to do. Make sure that the varietals and stuff you want to grow are going to work. Take good care of your plants. Say your prayers, make your offerings. Remember that the gods are with you. And you can find that the entire process from seed to plate will help you appreciate nearly all the gods within your pantheon, because nearly every god in any pantheon had something to do with survival. They just all do. So, thank you guys so much for sticking through that. If you don't have any more questions, also, by the way, Katie has a really good point. Veggies you thought you didn't like, you might like some homegrown varieties. Like, there are a number of lettuce varieties you will never be able to buy in stores because they don't ship very well. There are a number of other sort of vegetable varieties that you'll never see shipped in stores. I've grown a ton of different veggies that I didn't initially like. Brussels sprouts, for example, I will not buy in stores, but I will absolutely grow them because they taste amazing when you grow certain varietals. Yep, if you can, don't botch it. Make sure you absolutely follow the instructions for canning and stuff. But remember that these activities you're canning can become a devotional activity to Hestia. Gardening can become a devotional activity to the other gods. Again, I'm speaking obviously from a Hellenist perspective, but this can be applied to any polytheist system. Any of them. And I'm not saying that you absolutely have to appeal to the gods, but if you notice the title of the video, I said I was going to be talking about religion, so my atheist audience, you can disregard this bit of advice if you want to. But for those of you who are interested in getting closer to the gods, this is one of the ways to do that. And I'm not saying that you can't get closer to the gods unless you do this. I am not ever going to say that. I will never insist that you can't get closer to the gods unless you do anything in particular, because the gods are the gods and they decide that. I don't know their will. But I do know that my own relationship with my gods has gotten incredibly so much closer from having honored them as I've grown my own food, because I've come to appreciate the views that the ancients had. So with that in mind, if you've ever been curious to try it, if you've been scared to try it or whatever, now's the time to do it. Here's a religious justification if you needed one. Go for it. The rewards are incredible. Just the rewards of the flavor of the food that you cook is incredible. But if nothing else, that religious justification should give you all of the motivation you need to push you to start it if you've been thinking about doing so. So with that in mind, thank you guys so much for hanging out. There are 32 of you watching and 34 likes. Thank you guys so much. But if you haven't hit the like button yet, please do. If you're new and you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that as well. Pop down into the comments after the show goes down. Not just the live chat, but the comments help out a lot with promoting these videos in the algorithm. Please pop down there. Let me know what tips you got that you haven't considered before. Let me know what sort of tips you have. If you're a gardener, give some tips for your people in your area or for planning and putting up the harvest. Books and stuff. Don't link them because YouTube will block the comment, but like recommend titles and stuff of books that you really, really like for putting up harvest or for growing. I recommended Seed to Seed. I recommended Square Foot Gardening. I recommended Carrots Love Tomatoes. I recommended Keeping the Harvest. I recommended the Ball Book of Preserving. And I recommended, there's a book called Hanging Baskets that is also very good. It has a lot of various hanging basket arrangements for different seasons for growing food. So I highly recommend all of those books. You can rewind the video once the VOD goes up if you want to get those recommendations again. But please drop down into the comments. Let people know what works really well for you. Let people know what you found helpful in the video. Let me know what tips you hadn't thought of before. Let me know if you're thinking about trying this and why. What motivated you? Tell me stories about, because I read all of my comments. I don't respond to all of them, but I do read them all. Like, I check them every day. Let me know ways that your relationship with your gods have changed because of your gardening. Like, talk about that a little bit. It helps out a lot with the algorithm, but also it helps each other out. I've noticed a lot of people get into really wonderful discussions in the comment section based off of each other's tips and stories. It's a huge community building thing, so please do drop down into the comments, talk to each other, discuss this. If you want to discuss things in the Discord, there's a link in the description if you're not already there. Discussions can happen in Xenon and general chat if you guys want to talk about the topic of the video a little bit. I'm going to be continuing the discussions that I've had going on in community events. Those of you who are in the server knows what those are. As always, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. We're stronger together. Good luck with your own gardening and with putting things up. And as always, on Twitter and in Discord and on Patreon, I will be posting a ton of pictures of all the stuff coming out of my garden over the course of canning season. I'm going to do my best to get the video on deepening your relationship with the gods put up this week for Thursday. I'm hoping that if my net gets fixed tomorrow that I'll be able to do that. But so far, I have been having a dang hard time making time for it between canning season and the fact that my net's been really spotty. So I'm going to do my best. But thank you guys again. And as I say at the end of every video, we're stronger together.